If you picked up your phone tonight looking for something that would keep you up until 3 a.m., you just found it. This is the story of a woman who answered a phone call and heard the one sound that destroyed everything she thought she knew about her own life: her husband's voice, her best friend's laugh, and two words that rewrote 12 years of marriage in under 60 seconds. Stay with me until the end, because this story only gets darker before it gets free. If this kind of story hits you somewhere real, hit the like button right now and drop a comment with the name of your city. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain had been falling over Seattle for 3 days straight, the kind of cold, relentless rain that didn't announce itself dramatically but simply arrived and refused to leave, soaking through everything: parked cars, awnings, the collars of people who thought they'd checked the forecast. Claire Ashford stood in the parking garage of the Meridian Hotel, her heels damp, her umbrella broken at the hinge, her phone pressed to her ear while the fluorescent lights above her buzzed with that particular exhausted frequency that made her feel like the city itself was running on fumes. She had missed a call from Elias 20 minutes ago. That was nothing unusual. Elias Mercer missed calls and returned them on his own schedule, always had, and she'd long since stopped treating a missed call as anything beyond what it was: bad timing, a crowded room, a meeting that ran long. So she called back, heard it ring twice, then heard the quiet mechanical click of connection. No voice, just ambient sound. The kind of silence that meant he'd pocket dialed her, or the call had connected accidentally, and in a few seconds the line would drop. She almost hung up. She doesn't know, even now, why she didn't. Maybe it was the quality of the sound on the other end, not the white noise of an empty pocket, but something with texture to it. A room, an interior space with carpeting and low light, the kind of acoustic softness that suggested somewhere expensive. Maybe it was instinct that has no language for itself, just a pressure in the chest that tells you to stay still. She stayed still. She heard footsteps, heels on hardwood, then carpet, the quiet of a door being closed behind someone. And then, cutting through the silence like a thread pulled tight, a laugh. She knew that laugh. It was soft and low and slightly private, the kind of laugh people use when they feel completely safe, the kind Claire had heard across 1,000 cups of coffee and late-night phone calls and long weekends upstate. She had heard that laugh in hospital waiting rooms and at her own wedding. She had built 12 years of friendship around the woman who owned it, Naomi Cross. Claire's thumb pressed flat against the side of the phone, hard enough that the edge bit into her skin. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The parking garage went silent around her. The distant echo of a car door somewhere on the upper level, the rain sheeting down outside the entrance ramp, the buzz of those lights. And Claire stood in the middle of all of it as the world she recognized began to quietly rearrange itself into something she didn't. She heard Elias's voice next, but not the version she knew. Not the measured, slightly distracted voice of a man who ran a successful investment firm, who remembered her coffee order and forgot dentist appointments, who fell asleep reading and always smelled like cedar and something clean. This voice was different, lower. The kind of low that doesn't come from physical depth but from a decision, a register a person chooses when they are not performing pleasantness. Then Naomi said two words. "Good evening, Dawn." The phone nearly slipped from Claire's hand. Dawn. Not Elias, not even a nickname she'd heard him laugh off at a party or heard Naomi tease him with. Dawn. The word landed in Claire's ear with the specific weight of something deliberate, something that had been said in exactly this way many times before, something that carried the full architecture of a world Claire had never been invited into. She heard Elias respond, that altered voice, cold and exacting, and within 60 seconds he was talking about shipments, about a territory agreement that needed to be finalized before Thursday, about a council meeting. People entered the room. They spoke to him in short, contained sentences. Someone called him sir. Someone else used that word again, quieter, almost reverent. Dawn. Claire stood in the parking garage for however long the call lasted. She stopped counting. She stopped being aware of the cold or the broken umbrella or the buzzing lights. She was completely suspended in the sound coming through the phone. cataloging every detail the way a person does when they understand that what they're hearing will either be impossible to prove or impossible to forget. Before the line disconnected, she heard Naomi's voice again, quieter this time, closer to the phone, as if she'd walked toward where Elias had set it down on some surface. "She's still exactly where you wanted her," Naomi said. "I made sure of it." The call dropped. Claire looked at the screen. Call ended. 23 minutes, 14 seconds. She stood there until a car horn from the street jerked her back into her body. Then she walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the 4th floor, went to her room, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall with her coat still on. She did not sleep that night. She lay on top of the duvet until the Seattle rain turned the window gray, then pale, then the color of a morning that had no interest in comforting anyone. By 6 a.m., she had already made one decision. She was not going to call him. She was not going to go home early, or rearrange her face into suspicion, or give him any signal at all that anything had changed. Because here was the thing about the past 12 years of her marriage. She had always been the one who showed everything, and Elias, she now understood, had shown precisely what he wanted her to see. She needed to understand what she was inside before she made any move at all. So she went downstairs, ordered black coffee, and sat in the hotel restaurant with her phone and her legal pad and began writing down everything she remembered. Every business trip that ran longer than expected. There had been 18 in the past 2 years alone. She had tracked them once, absently, because she missed him, or missed whatever version of him she'd been allowed to know. Dubai, Singapore, Zurich, Buenos Aires, 3 to Hong Kong, 2 that were listed as domestic, but she'd never gotten specifics beyond Chicago. Every charity gala where she'd circulated the room alone for stretches because Elias was pulled away by someone who needed a quiet word. Every time she'd asked what he and so had discussed, and he'd said nothing alarming, just the standard language of investment people: allocation, exposure, emerging markets, positioning. Every night she'd reached across the bed and found it empty at 3 a.m. and assumed he was reading in the study. She filled 4 pages before the restaurant filled up with the breakfast crowd. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote Naomi's name at the top, and the pen went still in her hand. Naomi Cross. She had met Naomi during freshman orientation, a too-hot September afternoon in a dormitory common room at the University of Washington, when Naomi had walked over and said, without preamble, that she liked Claire's jacket. They'd been inseparable within a month. Naomi was quick and funny and completely unafraid of silence, which Claire, who had grown up filling every quiet moment with noise, found extraordinary. They'd lived together junior year. Naomi had driven Claire to every first date she'd had in her 20s and delivered the verdict on every man Claire brought home before Claire herself had finished deciding. She had been the maid of honor at Claire's wedding, had stood at the altar in slate gray chiffon and cried actual tears. "She's still exactly where you wanted her. I made sure of it." Claire pressed the pen to the pad until the tip made a small black star in the paper. What did that mean exactly? Where had Naomi kept her? In this marriage? In Seattle? In some geographic or emotional position that served Elias's purposes? The scope of it was still unclear, and Claire had learned enough in her life, from her mother, from watching other people handle crisis badly, that moving before you understood the full shape of a thing was how you got destroyed. She needed help. Quietly. Someone who knew how to look at things she couldn't see. She thought about who she knew: lawyers, accountants, a few financial contacts from the early days when she'd worked in wealth management. None of them were right for what she was beginning to understand she needed. She went back to her room and called her former colleague, Priya, who now worked in corporate risk management, and without explaining why, asked her for the name of someone who did private investigative work at a serious level. Not a divorce PI. Someone who'd worked government or federal before going private. Someone with real reach. Priya gave her a name, asked no questions, and texted the contact 30 seconds after they hung up. Gavin Rhodes. The number was a Seattle area code. Claire called him from the hotel bathroom with the shower running, which she recognized as paranoid and did anyway. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was unhurried. "Rhodes. I was given your number by Priya Khatri," Claire said. "I need help with something that I can't explain fully over the phone. It involves my husband, and it's serious." A pause. Not hesitation. more like assessment. When can you meet? Today. As soon as you're available. They met at 11 a.m. at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill that was just busy enough to muffle conversation, just unfashionable enough that no one Elias knew would walk through the door. Gavin Rhodes was in his mid-40s, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time listening to people under pressure. He had sharp eyes set in an otherwise neutral face, the kind of face that gave nothing away and probably never had. And when Claire sat down across from him and set her legal pad on the table, he looked at it without touching it. "Tell me what you heard," he said. Word for word. She told him. She told him everything from the moment the call connected, and she did it cleanly, no editorializing, the way she'd taught herself to present information in her years of client work. Just facts, just sequence, just what was said and in what order. When she finished, Gavin's coffee cup was still full, and he hadn't written anything down. "This name," he said, "the Don." That's what she called him. "And you're certain it wasn't context-specific, like a joke?" "There is nothing in 12 years of marriage that makes that word funny between my husband and anyone." Claire kept her voice even. "There were other people in the room. They were using it too. I heard it at least 3 more times." Gavin nodded slowly. He picked up his cup. "Your husband's company. Do you know how it operates? Where the capital comes from?" "I know what he told me. Fund of funds structure, institutional clients, some family office work. I never had reason to look deeper. I worked in wealth management myself for 4 years. I understood enough that the explanations were plausible." She paused. "I stopped working when we moved to the house. He asked me to. I thought it was about our schedule and the trips. I said yes." She heard how that sounded and pushed past it. "I want to know who he actually is." Gavin set down his cup. "That's going to take time, and it's going to cost." "I understand. And if what you heard is what it sounds like, if there's actual organized criminal infrastructure under that company, you need to understand that this becomes complicated very quickly. There are ways this information goes and ways it doesn't. You'd need to know that going in." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'm not calling this into anyone until I understand what I'm actually looking at. That's why I called you first." He looked at her for a moment in that neutral, assessing way. Then he opened his own notebook. "I'm going to need full names, dates, every business trip you can document, any corporate entities you've seen on paperwork in the house, and your best friend. I'll need everything you know about her." Claire didn't flinch. "I'll have a file to you by tonight." She went back to the hotel room and wrote for 6 hours. It was the most organized she had been in years. Dates, names, addresses, company names she'd seen on letterheads in Elias's study, the names of the men who came to certain dinners that were never quite explained as business dinners, but always felt like something more structured. She wrote about Naomi too, where they'd met, the timeline of their friendship, the apartment Naomi had helped her find when she first moved to Seattle after grad school, the job Naomi had encouraged her to leave, the relationship before Elias that Naomi had called a dead end 3 months before it ended, the way Naomi had introduced her to Elias at a rooftop party and said, with that private laugh, "I think you two should talk." She had always thought of that as one of the best things Naomi ever did for her. She finished the file at 7 p.m. and sent it to Gavin encrypted. Then she ordered room service, ate approximately half of it, and sat by the window watching the rain run down the glass of the Seattle skyline while she tried to locate the shape of her own life. She was 36 years old. She had been with Elias since she was 24, married since 27. She had a house in Laurelhurst with high ceilings and a kitchen she'd renovated twice. She had a wardrobe that suited the wife of a successful man. She had friendships that she was beginning to understand may have been cultivated on someone else's behalf. She had a memory full of vacations and dinners and private moments that she now could not verify were real in any meaningful sense. She pressed her palm flat to the cold window glass. The thing that kept returning to her, not the betrayal, not the criminal architecture of it, not even the scale of the deception, was a single, almost ordinary detail. Naomi had sat across from her at brunch 11 days ago and listened to Claire talk about how she'd been feeling disconnected from Elias, how she thought maybe they needed therapy, how she was tired of feeling like a satellite in her own marriage. And Naomi had nodded, reached across the table, squeezed her hand, said, "You're not imagining it. It's hard. But you love him. Give it time." Claire took her palm off the glass. The cold lingered on her skin for a moment, then faded. She had 1 week before Elias came home from what he'd called a Hong Kong meeting. 1 week to understand enough to know what to do next. 1 week to figure out whether the last 12 years of her life constituted a marriage or containment strategy. She went to sleep before 10 p.m., which surprised her. She didn't dream. Or if she did, she didn't remember it. What she woke up to at 5:30 in the morning was her phone buzzing on the nightstand. A message from Gavin. 4 words. "We need to meet." Below it, a photo. Not a surveillance image, just a screenshot from what looked like a financial database. She had to enlarge it to read the text. 2 words were highlighted in yellow. A name. Not Elias Mercer, Lucien Vale. And below it, a designation she'd seen once or twice in passing during her investment days, always in connection with things that no respectable firm touched. A flag that meant federal interest, ongoing investigation, organized crime adjacent. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she got up, went to the bathroom, and washed her face with cold water. She looked at herself in the mirror. No makeup, sleep creased, hair pulled back, and she thought, "This is the last morning I will ever spend inside this particular ignorance." Then she picked up her phone and texted Gavin back. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. She dressed in the dark, took the elevator down, and stepped out into a Seattle morning that was cold and pale and still and utterly indifferent. She pulled her coat tight around her and walked toward the parking structure, and the rain, for the first time in 3 days, had stopped. She didn't notice. She was already thinking about what a man named Lucien Vale might have done with 12 years of her life, and what she was going to do with the rest of it. Gavin's file was thicker than she expected. That was the first sign that whoever Elias Mercer was, Lucien Vale had been something else entirely, and had been, for a very long time. Gavin Rhodes did not work out of an office. He worked out of a second-floor apartment in the Fremont neighborhood that smelled like printer ink and cold coffee, with blackout curtains on every window and 3 monitors arranged in a shallow arc on a desk that had clearly never been used for anything recreational. There were no plants, no photographs. A single folding chair on the visitor's side of the desk, which Claire sat in now with her coat still buttoned because the room was cold enough that she could see her breath in the corners near the windows. Gavin stood with his back to her, pulling printed pages from one of the monitors and laying them face up on the desk in a sequence that meant something to him. She watched him work and didn't speak. She'd already learned in the 40 minutes since she arrived that Gavin Rhodes explained things exactly once and didn't appreciate interruption. "Elias Mercer," he said, without turning around, "was incorporated as a legal identity 22 years ago. Birth certificate, social security history, academic records going back to high school, all of it real enough to pass standard background checks. The kind of documentation that takes serious money and serious connections to build." He turned around and looked at her. "Which tells you this wasn't improvised. Lucien Vale didn't become Elias Mercer because he needed a quick cover. He built Elias Mercer because he intended to stay inside him for a very long time." Claire looked at the papers he'd laid out. Photographs, corporate filings. A network diagram drawn by hand on a large sheet of paper, names connected by lines in different colors, some circled, some crossed out. "How long have federal agencies been looking for him?" "First reference I can find is 9 years ago. Task force out of the DOJ, joint operation with Treasury. They knew the name Lucien Vale, knew the architecture of the organization, but couldn't attach it to a face, couldn't place him in a room, physically, at a specific time. Every wire they ran went cold at the edges. Every informant they flipped described the same thing, orders coming down through layers, lieutenants who'd never met the man at the top. They knew he existed the way you know a current exists in deep water. You feel it. You can't see it. But they never found him. They never found Elias Mercer. Gavin sat down across from her, which is different. Claire looked at the network diagram. Near the top, in a circle with heavier ink than the others, was a name she didn't recognize. A holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. Below it, branching outward like a root system, were other entities. Some she recognized from Elias's paperwork, some she'd never seen. And there, Connected to two separate branches by lines in red ink was a name written in Gavin's compact, neutral handwriting: Naomi Cross. She had known it was coming, seen it still landed like something physical. "Tell me about her," Claire said, and her voice was steady because she had decided in the elevator on the way up that she was not going to fall apart in this room. Gavin pulled a separate folder from the left side of the desk and opened it. Naomi Cross has a legitimate public profile: interior design consultant, some corporate work, a client list that reads clean. But she's also been present at 11 of the 14 events I've confirmed as syndicate adjacent in the last 3 years. Not as a +1, not as a date. She's in the background of surveillance photos from 2 separate federal operations, neither of which flagged her because she was never the subject. She's good at being in a room without being in the record of the room. "She was recruited before I met her," Claire said. It wasn't a question. Gavin looked at her carefully. "That's the working theory." "Freshman orientation, September. She walked up to me and said she liked my jacket." Claire heard herself say it out loud, and the absurdity of it was not funny in any way. It was something else, something closer to the feeling of stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. 12 years. She was placed there 12 years ago. I can't confirm the exact timeline yet, but the relationship between Vale and this organization goes back at least 15 years, which means the infrastructure for maintaining his cover, which included, from what I can piece together, strategic social relationships for the people closest to him, was in place before he became Elias Mercer in any public sense. He paused. "I'm sorry. I know what that means." "Don't," Claire shook her head once. "Just keep going." He kept going. The next hour was the worst hour of her adult life, and it was made worse by the fact that she had to hold herself completely still through all of it. Gavin walked her through the architecture of Lucian Vale's organization. Not all of it, he was careful to say, because federal agencies with 9 years of dedicated investigation hadn't gotten all of it, but enough. Enough to understand that the investment company was a laundering front, that the charitable foundations Elias attended galas for were partially real and partially structural, that the overseas trips ran parallel to meetings between criminal entities that controlled distribution networks across 4 countries and port access in 2 more. Elias Mercer attended charity events and had a wine cellar and forgot dentist appointments. Lucian Vale ran a criminal empire with the precision of a man who had spent his entire life building something that no one could ever touch. And he had built Claire into the center of it, not as a participant, as a facade. The devoted wife, the respectable woman with the warm house in Laurelhurst who didn't know anything and whose very existence broadcast normalcy to anyone who might look too closely. A man with a wife like Claire, with a marriage that long, with a domestic life that real. That man could not be what Lucian Vale was. That was the logic. She had been the best cover he could buy, and Naomi had been the mechanism to keep the cover in place. Every time Claire had wanted to leave, and she had, twice, both times well after midnight, sitting in the kitchen with a glass of wine and the particular clarity that comes with exhaustion and honesty, Naomi had talked her back. Not manipulatively. That was the part that made it so precise. Naomi had always said the true things, the real things about the relationship, had acknowledged the distance and the absences and the way Elias could make you feel peripheral in your own life. She just always arrived at the conclusion that staying was the right call, that it was worth it, that the good things were real. Claire had believed her because Claire trusted her more than she trusted herself. She left Gavin's apartment at just past noon with a USB drive in her coat pocket and a specific controlled kind of fury in her chest that she recognized from her mother, from watching her mother handle the worst things without combusting, as the kind of feeling that was most useful when it was kept just below the surface rather than spent all at once. She went back to the hotel. She did not call Naomi. She did not call Elias. She did not call anyone from what she now thought of with grim precision as her managed life. She sat at the desk in her hotel room and opened her laptop and looked at what she actually had. She had Gavin's file. She had the network diagram. She had 12 years of a marriage that had been a performance, at least on one side. And she had a phone recording, the 23-minute call still in her cloud backup because she was pathologically organized about her phone settings, one of the things Elias had always teased her about, in which the voice of her husband spoke as someone else entirely about things that would put him in a federal facility for the rest of his life. She also had something Gavin didn't know about yet, something she hadn't mentioned because she wanted to understand it herself first. 2 months ago, Elias had asked her to sign a document. Routine, he'd said, a restructuring of one of the family trusts, the kind of paperwork that accumulated in wealthy households and meant nothing. She'd almost signed it without reading it. She almost always did. But that night she'd had 2 glasses of wine and was in the particular contrary mood that made her read things carefully just to prove she could. And she'd gotten 3 pages in before she hit a clause she didn't understand. She'd asked Elias about it. He'd explained it in terms that were plausible and slightly too smooth. She'd signed, but she'd photographed every page first because she was pathologically organized about her phone settings. She pulled those photographs up now and went through them slowly, on the hotel desk, with the kind of attention she hadn't given them the first time. By the 3rd page, she had identified 3 entity names she'd now seen in Gavin's network diagram. By the 5th page, she understood that she had signed over limited power of attorney for a trust that, if Gavin's diagram was correct, served as a primary vehicle for asset movement within Lucian Vale's financial infrastructure. She had signed it. Her name was on it. She was, on paper, connected. She stood up from the desk and went to the window and stood there with her hands at her sides and breathed through it. Once, twice, the way her mother had taught her. Not deep breathing, not the theatrical kind, just finding the bottom of the breath and staying there for a second before coming back up. She was not panicking, she was assessing. What it meant was this: she was not simply the wife who didn't know. She was the wife whose signature was on the document. If this came apart in the wrong sequence, if federal investigators found that trust before she found a way to explain her involvement, she could be pulled into this in ways that had nothing to do with the actual truth of her ignorance. Elias had done it deliberately. She knew that with the kind of certainty that doesn't need proof because it fits too perfectly with everything else. He'd needed her signature on something real to insulate a key asset. So he'd waited until a moment when she was tired and wine-soft and trusting, and he'd handed her a pen, and she'd given him exactly what he needed. She called Gavin. "I need to come back," she said. "When?" "Now." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you find?" "I signed something 2 months ago that I need you to look at." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality. Not alarmed, but sharpened. "I'll be here." She went back. She showed him the photographs. She watched his face as he went through them, and Gavin Rhodes had a face that gave away almost nothing, but on the 7th page something moved behind his eyes that she'd already started to recognize as his version of concern. "You didn't know what this was," he said. "No." "But your name is on it." "Yes." He set the photographs down. He looked at her directly. "Claire, I need you to understand something. I have contacts inside the FBI's Organized Crime Division, people I worked with before I went private. I've been careful not to go to them yet because you asked me to build the picture first, which was the right call." He paused. "But this changes the timeline. Because if an investigation opens on Vale's financial infrastructure from any direction and this trust surfaces, you become a person of interest by default." "I know. So we need to move faster than I planned." He leaned back. "And I need to know something. Is there anything else? Anything you haven't told me that connects you on paper to his operations? Any signatures, any accounts, any corporate documents?" Claire thought. She went through everything she could remember. Every piece of paper Elias had put in front of her over 12 years. She had signed things. You sign things when you're married. You sign joint tax returns and refinancing documents and estate planning forms, and things you trust the person across from you to have read and understood. She had signed all of those things. Most of them were routine. The one from 2 months ago was not. "Nothing else that I can identify as significant," she said carefully. "But I can't be certain." Gavin nodded. He was quiet for a moment, thinking in that still way he had. Then he said, "I want you to go back to the hotel. I want you to act normally for the next 48 hours. If Elias calls, you answer. You sound like yourself. You don't deviate." He's in Hong Kong for another 6 days. Good. That gives us time. He paused. There's one more thing I need to tell you about the surveillance footage. She waited. Naomi Cross attended a meeting in Portland 8 weeks ago. A meeting I can place inside Vale's operational structure. She wasn't there as an operative running an errand. He looked at the network diagram on his desk. She was at the table, center of the table. There were 8 people in the room, and she was the one who ran the agenda. Claire stared at him. That's not a subordinate role. No, Gavin said. It's not. She drove back to the hotel in the rental car with the heater running and the radio off and the Seattle skyline going gray and wet on her left side. She tried to organize what she now understood into something with a shape she could work with. Naomi wasn't just an operative. Naomi had been running something, which meant Naomi's relationship with Elias, with Lucien Vale, was not simply that of a faithful soldier or even a trusted lieutenant. There was power there, ambition. A woman who ran the agenda at a table of 8 did not do so on someone else's behalf forever. She's still exactly where you wanted her. I made sure of it. Claire had heard that line as confirmation, as Naomi reporting to Elias, keeping the domestic infrastructure of his cover intact. But what if it was also something else? What if it was a woman managing an asset, managing Claire, not only for Elias's benefit, but for her own? Keeping Claire stable, keeping the marriage intact, keeping everything in its predetermined position. Not because Naomi was loyal to Elias, but because the whole structure served something Naomi was building toward? Claire sat in the hotel parking structure for a long time before going inside. She ordered dinner she didn't eat. She ran a bath she didn't get into. She sat on the edge of the bed in the blue dark of the hotel room, coat off now, shoes off. And she thought about Naomi Cross with the kind of slow, methodical focus she usually reserved for financial analysis. Because that was what this required now. Not grief, not fury. Analysis. When her phone rang at 9:47 p.m. and the screen showed Naomi's name, Claire sat there and watched it ring 4 times. Then she picked up. Hey. She made her voice normal, slightly tired, the way she would have sounded on any ordinary hotel room evening. Sorry, I was in the bath. No worries. Naomi's voice was warm, completely untroubled. 12 years of listening to that voice, and Claire heard it now with new instruments. Just checking in. You sounded a little off when we talked yesterday. Did I? Little bit. Everything okay with the conference? Fine. Just long days. Claire looked at the wall across the room. How was your week? Busy. Had a client in Portland that ran long. A pause. And then the laugh. That private, comfortable laugh. You know how it is. Some clients just can't make a decision without making it a whole thing. Portland. 8 weeks ago, a meeting. Last week, a client. The intervals were different, but the city was the same, and the ease with which Naomi delivered the lie was total. Not a stumble, not a fractional hesitation, just the truth-shaped sentence sliding into the space where the truth should have been. I do know, Claire said. Get some rest. I'll call you when I'm back. Can't wait. We'll do brunch. The place on Eastlake? Perfect. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her lap. Her hands were shaking, not visibly. The shake was internal, the kind that lives in the sternum rather than the fingers. She pressed both palms flat to her thighs and held them there until it stopped. Then she picked up the phone again and opened the cloud backup and found the audio file from the hotel parking garage. 23 minutes, 14 seconds. She put her earbuds in and listened to the whole thing again from the beginning, this time with the volume up and her eyes closed, and she cataloged every voice, every word, every pause. There was a moment at the 11-minute mark that she had not fully registered the first time. A moment where Naomi said something under the discussion about territories, while other voices were talking. She had to replay it 3 times with the volume as high as it would go before she was certain of what she was hearing. Naomi said to someone, not to Elias, to someone else, a voice Claire didn't recognize, 5 words. He won't see it coming. Claire pulled the earbuds out. She sat in the dark hotel room with the city lights drawing wet lines down the window, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had been wrong about the shape of this. Naomi wasn't keeping her in place for Elias. Naomi was keeping everything in place for herself. She was not managing Claire on behalf of a powerful man. She was managing Claire and Elias and an entire organization on behalf of a plan that had not yet detonated. He won't see it coming. Whatever Naomi was building toward, it wasn't loyalty. It wasn't love. It wasn't even ambition in the ordinary sense. It was a takeover. And Claire, who had spent 12 years being exactly where everyone wanted her, who had been managed and positioned and maintained like a piece in someone else's game, was sitting in the middle of the board with the only information that could blow the whole thing open before Naomi made her move. She picked up her phone and texted Gavin. 3 words. I found something. She pressed send and then she sat very still in the dark, because she had just understood something that changed everything. She was not only a victim in this story, she was, whether anyone had intended it or not, the only person alive who could see the whole board. Elias couldn't. Naomi thought she was blind. The federal investigators had 9 years of evidence and still couldn't place Lucian Vale in a room, but Claire could. Claire had his voice on tape. Claire had his signature on her marriage certificate. Claire had 12 years of proximity to the man beneath the cover, and she had the document she'd signed 2 months ago. And she had a best friend who had just told someone that he won't see it coming. She knew what she had to do. She didn't want to do it. She was not a woman who made scenes or put herself in the center of anything public and dangerous by choice. But she thought about the bath she hadn't gotten into, and the dinner she hadn't eaten, and the wedding photographs back in the house in Laurelhurst, and she thought about the woman on the phone tonight who had said, "See you at brunch on Eastlake," with that warm, easy laugh, and something in Claire's chest settled into a weight that was cold and very, very clear. She was going to walk directly into Elias Mercer's world, not to destroy him, not yet, but to make sure that when everything came apart, she was the one holding the thread that unraveled it. Not Naomi, not a federal task force that didn't know what they were looking at, not a criminal organization settling a power struggle in a warehouse somewhere. Her. She just needed 5 more days, an address that would make every person in a room look at her, and the kind of composure that is indistinguishable from confidence. She had all 3. The charity gala was in 4 days. Elias's gala. The Meridian Foundation annual dinner, which she had attended every year for the last 8 years as his wife, which was scheduled to go ahead in his absence, and which Naomi, she was almost certain, would attend. She pulled up the event website on her phone. Tickets still available. General admission, which she had never needed before because she had always arrived as the wife of the primary donor. She bought one, under her maiden name. Then she put the phone down, and for the first time since the parking garage, she slept. The dress was midnight blue, not black. Black would have been invisible, and Claire had spent enough of her life being invisible in rooms that belonged to her husband. Midnight blue was something else. It said, "I was always here, you just weren't paying attention." She bought it Tuesday afternoon at a boutique on Capitol Hill, paid cash, carried it back to the hotel in a white paper bag, and hung it on the back of the bathroom door where she could see it from the bed. She spent the next 3 days doing exactly what Gavin had told her to do. She answered Elias's calls from Hong Kong, 2 of them, both brief, both unremarkable, the kind of married couple check-ins that had long since shed any emotional texture and become purely logistical. She sounded like herself. She asked about the time difference. She said she was thinking of staying in the hotel another few days to decompress after the conference. He said, "Fine, take your time. The house is empty anyway." She did not tell Gavin she'd bought a ticket to the gala until Thursday morning, 36 hours before the event. He did not take it well. "That's not the move," he said. He was standing at his desk, which meant he was agitated, because Gavin Rhodes sat down for everything that didn't require standing. Walking into a room full of Vale's people, people who know your face, who know you as his wife, with no protection, no backup, no cleared exit, I know what I'm doing. I don't think you do. These aren't bankers, Claire. I know they're not bankers. She kept her voice level. That's why I'm going, because I need Naomi to see me there. I need her to understand that I know before she makes her move on Elias, because right now she thinks she has all the time in the world and a wife who's sitting in a hotel room feeling sorry for herself. Gavin looked at her for a moment. What exactly do you think walking into that gala accomplishes? It puts me in a position she doesn't control. She's been managing me for 12 years by keeping me in predictable spaces, places she recommended, situations she shaped. She cannot manage what she doesn't see coming. Claire paused. You told me she's planning something against Elias. You told me the surveillance from Portland suggests a move is imminent. If Naomi makes that move before we have everything we need, the whole organization goes to ground and nobody gets anything. So you're going to walk into the gala and do what? Announce yourself? Yes, Claire said simply. Gavin stared at her. Then he sat down. That's either the smartest thing I've heard this week, or it's going to get you killed. Tell me which one after Friday night. He spent the next 2 hours trying to build something around it. A minimal safety structure, he called it, which meant he would be in the building in a capacity no one would look at twice, with 2 people he trusted positioned at exits, and Claire would carry a device in her clutch that functioned as both a recorder and a panic signal. She agreed to all of it. She wasn't reckless. She just understood something Gavin, for all his competence, was still calculating, that the only leverage she had was surprise, and surprise had an expiration date. The Meridian Foundation annual dinner was held at the Cascade Ballroom in a downtown hotel that Elias had used for this event every year for the past 6 years. Claire had attended 8 of these evenings. She knew the layout the way you know the layout of your own home, not by thinking about it, but by moving through it without friction. She knew which corridor led to the service entrance and which elevator banks were staff only and where the secondary bar was set up in the anteroom when the main room got crowded. She had spent a lot of hours in this building feeling peripheral. Tonight, that geography was an asset. She arrived 20 minutes after the official start time, late enough that the room was full and the ambient noise was high and a single arrival would dissolve into the crowd. She checked her coat, adjusted the midnight blue dress once in the mirror by the entrance, and then walked in. The ballroom was exactly as she remembered. High ceilings, round tables dressed in white, the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than most people's rent. A string quartet she recognized from previous years. Waitstaff moving with the particular precision of expensive hired crews. And the guests, a mixture of Seattle money, corporate faces, some city figures she recognized from news coverage, and distributed through that crowd, invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, a handful of people she now recognized from Gavin's network diagram. She moved through the room slowly. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She smiled at 2 people she'd met at previous galas whose names she remembered, a habit from her investment days, filing names against faces, and exchanged exactly the right number of words before moving on. She was performing, but the performance was effortless because she had done this specific performance for 8 years. The only difference was that she knew what the stage looked like from underneath. She found Naomi at the 12 o'clock position relative to the room's entrance, standing near the east windows with a glass of champagne and 2 men Claire didn't recognize, talking with the easy authority of someone who belonged exactly where she was. She was wearing a deep green gown that Claire had never seen, and her hair was up, and she looked, objectively, extraordinary. Claire watched her for 90 seconds from across the room. Then she walked directly toward her. She saw the moment Naomi registered her. It happened at about 15 feet. A micro pause in whatever she was saying, a fractional stillness, eyes that widened by less than a millimeter before the rest of Naomi's face caught up and arranged itself into something that could pass for delighted surprise. She was good. She was incredibly good. Claire might have believed it once. Claire? Naomi's voice landed warm and confused in exactly the right ratio. What are you? I thought you were still at the hotel. I was. Claire stopped 2 feet from her, close enough to be read as intimate. I decided I didn't want to miss this. She let her eyes move briefly to the 2 men, who had already begun the social recalibration of people who sense a dynamic they don't have the context for. Could you give us a minute? The men excused themselves with the practiced ease of people accustomed to being excused. Naomi looked at her. The warmth was still there in her expression, but underneath it, Claire could see the machinery working, calculating, assessing, reaching for the interpretation that kept the situation controlled. You look incredible, Naomi said. That color is everything on you. I know about Lucian Vale, Claire said. The machinery stopped. It was barely visible. A quarter second of complete stillness in Naomi's face, the kind that happens before the conscious mind catches up with the body's recognition of danger. Then it was gone, and the warmth came back, and Naomi's head tilted in the way it always tilted when she was about to deliver a careful question. I don't know what... Don't. Claire kept her voice low and completely even. I heard the call. All 23 minutes of it. I have the recording, and I've had a week to learn things I should have known years ago, which means I also know about Portland, and I know what you're planning, and I need you to understand that what happens next depends entirely on this conversation going honestly. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the room hummed and moved, and the string quartet shifted into something with a slower tempo. Then Naomi took a small sip of her champagne, unhurried, and said, You want to find somewhere quieter? No, I want you to hear what I'm saying in this room, in public, with witnesses, so that what you're clearly already calculating, how to manage me out of this the way you've managed me out of everything else, doesn't feel like an option. Something shifted in Naomi's expression then. Not the warmth, which was gone now, replaced by something more honest and, Claire thought, more dangerous. It was the look of a person dropping a tool they've been carrying too long, the look of someone deciding to stop. How much do you know? Naomi said. Her voice was different now, not cold exactly, stripped the way a room sounds when you remove all the furniture. Enough to make the next 48 hours very complicated for you. Claire held her gaze. I know about the fund movements. I know about the Portland meeting. I know you're not running operations for Elias. I know you're building something separate. Naomi was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. Her champagne glass was perfectly still in her hand. Then she said, How long have you been working with investigators? And there it was. Not a denial, not the warm, concerned friend voice. A direct tactical question, delivered with the precision of someone who had been in enough rooms to know when the perimeter was compromised. Claire felt, briefly, the full vertigo of it. 12 years compressing into the space between two women standing 3 feet apart at a charity gala, and the person she was looking at had never existed. Long enough, Claire said. Naomi looked at her with something that might, in a different context, have passed for respect. Claire, whatever you think you know, I think I need to use the restroom, Claire said, because Gavin had told her, set the contact, demonstrate knowledge, don't negotiate in the open, get out. She had done the first 2, now she needed the 3rd. We'll continue this later. She turned and walked away without looking back, and she managed to do it without hurrying, which cost her more than anything else had so far. She was in the corridor toward the east restrooms when her phone vibrated. Gavin. She answered without stopping walking. I saw the contact, he said. You need to come out now. I know. Give me 2 minutes. Claire, there's a problem. She pushed into the restroom. Empty, marble, brutally well lit. She locked the door behind her. What problem? One of the men who was standing with her before you approached. I made him. He's not a donor. He's Naomi's, specifically. I've seen him in 2 of the surveillance photos from Portland. He moved when you walked away from her. He's currently in the corridor between you and the main exit. Claire looked at herself in the mirror, the midnight blue dress, the careful composure, the face of a woman who had been exactly where everyone wanted her for 12 years and had just announced in the middle of a ballroom that she was no longer interested in that arrangement. There's a service corridor off the east hallway, she said, 30 feet past where I am. I know it. My second contact is positioned near the freight exit at the end. I'm moving now. She left the restroom, turned left instead of right, walked at a pace that was quick without being a run. The kind of pace that a woman with somewhere to be moves at, purposeful, not panicked. The corridor was less crowded here, narrower, the lighting more institutional. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn around. 30 feet, 20. She pushed through the service door and the atmosphere changed immediately. Concrete floors, the smell of industrial cleaning fluid, the sound of kitchen equipment from somewhere below. She moved faster now. The man Gavin's contact intercepted at the freight exit was large and unhurried looking, which was more frightening than if he'd been visibly aggressive. He looked at Claire the way people look at things they've been asked to manage. Gavin's contact materialized from the left. Claire didn't recognize him, but he said her name once, quietly, and positioned himself between her and the large man and said something in a low voice that she didn't fully catch. She didn't stop to watch what happened. She went through the freight exit and into the alley behind the hotel, where the wet cold of Seattle night air hit her like a hand to the chest, and Gavin's car was idling 20 feet away. She got in. He pulled out without speaking. They were 4 blocks away before she realized she was still holding the glass of sparkling water. She had carried it out of the ballroom, through the corridor, through the service exit, and into the car. She looked at it. She set it carefully on the cup holder. "You made contact," Gavin said. It wasn't a question. She didn't deny anything. She asked me how long I'd been working with investigators. Claire looked out the window at the wet Seattle streets. She dropped it, the whole performance, just stopped. That means she shifted to a different mode. I know what it means. Gavin was quiet for a moment. He drove. The rain had started again, coming down in the thin, relentless way it had all week. My contact who intercepted at the exit, he said the man behind you was already on the phone when they made contact. Claire processed that. Calling who? Unknown, but the call was made before you reached the freight exit, which means by the time you got into this car, whoever he was calling already knew. She turned to look at Gavin's profile. He was watching the road, jaw set. Elias, she said. Possibly. Or Naomi's people. Could be either. Elias is in Hong Kong. There are phones in Hong Kong. She faced forward again. The streets were emptying out. It was past 10, and the rain was doing what Seattle rain always did, persuading people back indoors. She thought about what had just shifted. She had gone into this gala with a plan: make contact with Naomi, demonstrate knowledge, force her hand, disrupt the timeline of whatever Naomi was building toward. She had executed it. But something she hadn't fully factored had also happened. She had shown her cards. Not all of them, but enough. And now Naomi knew she was not sitting in a hotel room feeling sorry for herself. Naomi knew she had help. Naomi knew the clock had changed. I need to tell you something, Gavin said. Tell me. I got a call this afternoon, before the gala, from a contact inside Federal Organized Crime. He paused, choosing words with the care of someone disarming something. There's been movement in the investigation into Vale's organization. New financial intelligence, a series of fund transfers that federal analysts have been trying to trace for 6 months. They broke the trail 3 days ago. And? The transfers trace back to a trust. A family trust with a power of attorney signature on file. Claire went very still. Your signature, Claire. They have your signature and they have the trust documents. And as of this morning, there's an analyst in the DOJ Financial Crimes Unit who is building a case around those documents. He said it clean, no softening around the edges, because he was the kind of man who understood that softening something like this was a form of condescension. You're currently a person of active federal interest, not a target, not yet, but a person of interest, which means they are looking at everything connected to your name. The car felt smaller than it had 30 seconds ago. Claire sat with the information and let it settle the way you let something very heavy settle. Not trying to move it, just finding out how much of the floor it takes up. The signature Elias had me put on that trust, she said. Yes. He knew this would happen. Gavin's expression didn't change. I think he built it as a contingency. If his organization ever started to come apart, a wife who signed the documents gives investigators somewhere to look that isn't directly at him. It's not guaranteed protection, but it's redirection. It buys time. Claire thought about the night she'd signed it, the wine, the tiredness, his voice explaining things in that smooth, slightly too patient way, the pen he'd handed her, which had been her own pen. She remembered that specifically. He'd picked it up from the kitchen counter where she always left it, handed it to her like it was nothing, like it was the most ordinary gesture in the world. He had planned it. Not just the document, the entire evening, the timing, her state of mind, the gentleness of the ask. When you said not a target yet, Claire said, what does yet mean in terms of timeline? If the analyst builds the connection between the trust and active fund movements, which, based on what my contact described, could happen within the week, Then your status changes and you lose the ability to approach them on your own terms. So I need to go to them first. Yes. With everything. With everything you have. The recording, the financial documents, the trust paperwork, and the timeline of how you came to sign it, all of it, presented through proper legal counsel before they come to you. He glanced at her. It's the only move that keeps you outside the case as a defendant rather than inside it as one. Claire looked at the rain on the windshield. The wipers moved in their steady rhythm. She thought about what walking into a federal building meant, what it meant for the marriage, for the house, for the 12 years. But she was done thinking about those things as losses. They had never been hers to lose. They had been a set, and she had been the last prop placed on it, and the set was burning now regardless of what she did. What she was thinking about was Naomi, because here was what Gavin didn't know, what she hadn't yet told him, because she'd been building toward it, waiting to understand its full shape, was that the fund movements the federal analysts had just traced were not Elias's fund movements. She was almost certain of it. The trust she'd signed, the entity names she'd seen in the documents, the timing, 8 weeks ago, right around the Portland meeting. She had spent 3 days with Gavin's network diagram and her own 12 years of peripheral knowledge, and what she had assembled quietly in the margins of everything else was this. The transfers the DOJ was chasing did not originate with Lucian Vale. They originated with Naomi. Naomi had moved the money. Naomi had moved it through a trust that had Claire's signature on it, and Claire could not yet tell if that was collateral damage from Naomi's larger play, or if it was deliberate. If Naomi had specifically routed her theft through a vehicle that would land on Claire when it surfaced. She said none of this to Gavin yet. She needed to be certain. She needed one more piece. I need access to the full transfer records, she said. The ones your contact referenced. Can you get them? Not directly. They're inside an active investigation. Can your contact give you the originating entity names? Gavin looked at her sideways. Why? Because I think the federal investigation is about to arrest the wrong person for the fund movements. And I think whoever structured those transfers knew exactly what they were doing when they put my name on the paper underneath them. She turned to face him fully. I think Naomi set up Elias, set up me, and is planning to walk away clean while 2 federal investigations and a criminal organization all look at each other. The car was quiet except for the rain and the wipers. Gavin pulled over. Not at a destination, just to the curb on a quiet block, the way you pull over when you need to think without also driving. He sat for a moment. Then he said, If you're right, I know. Then she's been running a parallel operation inside his organization for years, diverting funds, building leverage, positioning herself. And she needed the marriage intact because a destabilized veil is an unpredictable veil, and unpredictable people make moves that disrupt timelines. She needed me happy enough and blind enough to keep Elias stable while she finished. Claire's voice was remarkably steady. And she almost pulled it off. 2 more weeks, maybe less, and she would have moved. Elias would have been handed to federal investigators, probably through an anonymous tip with carefully curated evidence, and she would have been somewhere with everything she'd built from the inside of his empire while he went to trial, and I got pulled into it as the wife who signed the documents. Gavin looked at her for a long moment. She was going to let you take the weight. She was going to make sure I took it. Claire looked out at the empty, wet street. She's been my best friend for 12 years. She knows exactly how I think, how I respond to pressure, how I make decisions when I'm frightened. She knew I would try to handle it quietly. She knew I'd be too careful, too methodical, too slow. A pause. She didn't count on me calling you in the first 48 hours. And she definitely didn't count on tonight. No. Claire felt something settle in her chest that was not calm exactly, but was close to it. The feeling of a decision that has fully arrived. She knows now that the timeline has changed, which means she'll move faster. Which means we have maybe 72 hours before she does something that locks everything into a shape we can't change. Gavin put the car back in drive. I'll get the entity names by morning. I need something else, too. Claire turned back to the rain-blurred windshield. I need to know where Naomi is going to be tomorrow night. Why? Because I'm not done talking to her. She paused. But next time I'm going to know everything, and I'm going to make sure she knows that I know it. Gavin said nothing for a moment, then, "That's a different kind of risk than tonight." "I know," Claire said. "Tonight I showed her I wasn't blind. Tomorrow I need to show her I'm not afraid." The car moved through the wet Seattle streets, and Claire sat in the passenger seat with her midnight blue dress and her empty hands, and she thought about a girl in a dormitory common room who had walked over and said she liked her jacket, and she thought about everything that sentence had actually been the beginning of, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not grief, not rage, something colder and more clarifying than either. She thought, I have been inside someone else's story for 12 years. And then, with a quietness that surprised her, that ends now. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't know, sitting in that car with the rain coming down and Gavin's headlights cutting through the dark, was that Naomi had already made her call, that the man at the freight exit had reached someone, and that someone had reached someone else, and that the chain of contact that resulted from Claire walking into that ballroom in midnight blue had already traveled further and faster than either she or Gavin had calculated, and that Elias Mercer, Lucien Vale, was no longer in Hong Kong. Gavin's phone rang at 2:14 a.m. Claire was on the couch in his apartment, still in the midnight blue dress with her heels off and her feet pulled under her, going through the network diagram for the fourth time with a red pen making notations in the margins. She heard him answer in the next room, heard the quality of his voice change, not louder, just different, the way a frequency changes when something solid comes into its path, and she set down the pen. He came to the doorway. He looked at her with the expression she had already learned to read as the one he used when the information was bad enough that he was choosing how to deliver it rather than whether to. "He landed at SeaTac 40 minutes ago," Gavin said. Claire set the diagram down on the coffee table. Elias. Customs has him clearing international arrivals at 1:31 a.m. My contact pulled the manifest. He paused. He wasn't alone. 3 men traveling on the same booking, nobody I can identify yet, but the travel pattern is, it's not a man coming home early from a business trip. "No," Claire said, "it's not." She stood up, her feet on the cold floor of Gavin's apartment, the red pen still in her hand. She thought about the house in Laurelhurst, high ceilings, the kitchen she'd renovated twice, her own clothes in the closet, her own handwriting on the grocery list that was probably still on the refrigerator. She had not been home in 9 days. "He'll go to the house first," she said. "Probably. And when I'm not there?" Gavin looked at her steadily. "He'll call. And when I don't answer?" Neither of them said the next part out loud. They didn't need to. The man at the freight exit had made a phone call, and that call had crossed an ocean. And now Lucien Vale was in Seattle at 2 a.m. with 3 men who weren't on a business trip, and the wife who had spent 12 years being exactly where he wanted her was standing in a private investigator's apartment in Fremont with a red pen and a network diagram and 48 hours worth of information that could dismantle everything he'd built. "I can't stay here," she said. "No, he'll find this address eventually. Not tonight, but not tonight is enough." She was already moving, finding her heels, her coat, her bag. Her mind was doing the thing it did when it was working properly. Not racing, just moving cleanly from one point to the next. The way water finds the lowest path without deliberating about it. "I need a place for tonight. Somewhere with no connection to me, no connection to you. I have a contact who keeps a unit in Belltown. Off the books. Call them." While Gavin made the call, Claire went to the bathroom and washed her face and stood over the sink looking at the drain for a moment. She was not frightened. She identified that with some surprise, not the absence of fear, which would have been its own kind of alarming, but the presence of something that wasn't fear, something she could only describe as the sensation of a narrowing. Like the situation had simplified itself down to its essential elements. There was Elias. There was Naomi. There was what Claire knew. Everything else, the dress, the house, the marriage, the 12 years, had become irrelevant in the way that furniture becomes irrelevant when a building is on fire. She straightened up. She dried her face. She went back out. They drove to Belltown through empty streets. The unit was on the 8th floor of a building that didn't have its name on the door, and the man Gavin's contact had called met them in the lobby without conversation, and handed over a key card and left. The unit was sparse: a bed, a table, a window facing the sound, the kind of place that existed to be undistinguishing. Claire sat at the table and opened her laptop. "Get some sleep," Gavin said from the doorway. "In a while." He looked at her. He was going to say something else, she could tell, and then he decided against it, which she appreciated. He left. She heard the elevator. She spent the next 2 hours building a document. Not for Gavin, not yet. For herself. A full reconstruction. The call, the recording, the trust documents, the entity names, the fund transfer timeline, Naomi's presence at Portland, the gala contact, everything in sequence, annotated with sources, the way she had been trained to build a client file in her investment days. Tight, sourced, followable by someone who came to it cold. At 4:30 a.m., she emailed it to an address she had created 3 days ago, used by no one, connecting to nothing. A backup in case everything else disappeared. At 4:47, she lay down on the bed without undressing and was asleep within 4 minutes. Her phone woke her at 7:52 a.m. Not Gavin. Not Elias. Naomi. She stared at the screen through 1 ring, 2 rings, and then she answered. "You left early last night," Naomi said. Her voice was clear, morning bright, completely composed. Whatever she'd spent the night doing, it hadn't cost her sleep, or she'd recovered from it completely. "I was hoping we could finish our conversation." "I'm sure you were." Claire. A pause, just 1 beat, calibrated. "I think there are things you deserve to understand, from me, not from whoever you've been working with." "You mean the things I deserve to understand because knowing them might change what I do with the other things I already know?" A short silence. "You've gotten sharper." "I was always sharp, you just needed me not to be." She heard Naomi breathe, a small, almost involuntary exhale that she'd heard 1,000 times across 1,000 conversations, and that she now understood meant that Naomi was shifting approach, recalibrating, the way you recalibrate when a route you planned is suddenly unavailable. "I want to meet," Naomi said. "Today. Just us." "Why would I do that?" "Because Elias is back. You know that. I can tell from your voice that you know that. And because what happens in the next 24 hours is going to define the rest of your life. And I am the only person who can tell you the full shape of it." A pause. "I'm not your enemy, Claire. I never was. What I did, I know how it looks. But there are things that don't look like what they are." "There are things you need from me," Claire said. "That's what this call is." Naomi said nothing for a moment. Then, "The waterfront, the end of Pier 66, noon." "Why there?" "Because it's public enough that you'll feel safe and isolated enough that we can talk." Her voice dropped slightly. "And because I need you to hear what I have to say before Elias finds you. Claire, he knows you were at the gala, he knows you spoke to me, and the man he is when the cover is threatened is not the man you're married to." The line went quiet. Claire said, "Noon," and hung up. She called Gavin immediately. He answered before the first ring finished, which meant he hadn't slept either. "She called me," Claire said. "I know. I had your phone flagged for incoming contacts." "You could have told me that." "Would it have changed anything?" She conceded the point without saying so. "She wants to meet at noon, Pier 66. "It's a setup." "Probably. Or she's genuinely panicked and needs to move me into a position before Elias does." Claire stood at the window. The sound was flat and gray this morning, a container ship moving slowly through the distant channel. "Either way, I need to be there." "Claire, she said he knows I was at the gala. He knows I spoke to her. Gavin, if Lucien Vale is looking for me and I'm sitting in a Belltown safe house waiting, I'm just a thing to be found. I need to be in motion." She watched the container ship. "Can you cover Pier 66? A pause. She could hear him thinking. Not hesitating, actually thinking, which were different. "I can have 3 positions covered within 2 hours, but I need you to carry the panic device, stay in the open section of the pier, and if anything moves wrong, you abort immediately." Agreed. "And Claire, if it is a setup, if Naomi's people are there, or Elias's people, there's a limit to what I can do." "I know," she said. That's my risk to take. She showered, changed into the clothes Gavin had arranged to have sent over. Dark jeans, a gray jacket, things that moved well and didn't announce themselves. And she was at Pier 66 at 11:43 a.m. with the panic device in her jacket pocket and her phone in her hand, and the cold Seattle air coming off the sound in long, salt-edged gusts that cut through everything. She walked to the end of the pier and stood with her back to the water and watched the approach. Naomi arrived at 11:58, alone, as far as Claire could see. She scanned the pier in both directions, and Gavin's voice came briefly through the single earbud she wore, telling her the positions were clear, one person possibly holding 30 meters back that he was monitoring but not sure of. Naomi was in a long coat, hair down, no bag. She walked straight to Claire and stopped 4 feet away and looked at her with an expression that Claire had never seen on her face before because it wasn't managed. It was just her face, without anything laid over it. "Thank you for coming," Naomi said. "Tell me what you need to tell me." Naomi looked at the water for a moment. The wind took her hair across her face, and she didn't fix it. "I was 19 when Lucien recruited me. Not the way you're thinking. I wasn't hired. I was owned. My father owed money to people connected to his network, and the way that debt got settled was me." She paused. "I didn't walk up to you in that common room because I was told to. I walked up to you because you looked like someone who had no idea how ugly the world actually was, and I thought—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter what I thought. Tell me anyway." "I thought if I could be close to someone like that, maybe I could stay like that. Maybe it would—" She stopped again. The wind came off the water. "It wasn't just an assignment, Claire. You were real. Everything between us was real. And keeping me in that marriage, managing me, reporting back, was that real too?" Naomi's jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do to survive. And then it became what I did to build something, yes, because the alternative was spending my life as a liability inside someone else's operation. And I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to do that. So you built your own, yes, inside his, without him knowing. He knew some of it. He thought it was loyalty, expansion on his behalf." Her voice was flat now, past the point of performance. "He didn't know the money was moving to structures he couldn't reach. He didn't know the alliances I was building were mine. And my signature on the trust documents." Naomi was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "That wasn't designed to harm you. But it would have. Things were moving faster than I planned. I needed that trust insulated before the transfers became traceable. And the cleanest vehicle—" She stopped. "I knew you'd signed it without reading it fully. I told him to use it." The air between them went still despite the wind. Claire looked at her. At this woman she had known for 12 years, whose voice she had heard across hospital waiting rooms and late-night phone calls in her own wedding, and she felt something that was neither grief nor fury, but some compound of both that had no good name. "You handed me to a federal investigation," Claire said, "to buy yourself time. I was going to get you out of it. Once I'd made my move, I was going to give your attorneys everything they needed to establish your ignorance." "You don't get to decide that," Claire said. "That was never yours to decide." Naomi looked at her, and in that look, for just a second, was something genuine. Not guilt exactly, but the acknowledgement of a cost that had been incurred and not paid. Then Gavin's voice came through the earbud, low and immediate. "Claire, the individual I flagged 30 meters back has moved. He's at 20 meters. He's on a phone." Claire kept her face still. "Who sent him?" she said to Naomi. Not a question. Naomi's expression shifted, a micro-contraction around the eyes. "What?" "The man behind me. 20 meters. Who sent him? You or Elias?" Naomi's eyes moved to the space behind Claire, involuntary, the way eyes move when a name lands near something real, and in that fraction of a second Claire had her answer. Not Naomi's person. Someone else's. Elias. "He had you followed," Claire said. "I didn't—" Naomi's voice was the first genuinely uncontrolled thing Claire had heard from her in 2 days. "I didn't tell him about this meeting. He didn't need you to. He had your phone flagged. Same way my investigator had mine." Claire was already turning, scanning, finding the man Gavin had described. Medium height, dark jacket, currently not pretending to look at his phone anymore, looking directly at her. He's been listening to everything you just said. Naomi went pale. Not figuratively. The color actually left her face, in the specific way it leaves the faces of people who have just understood that the careful architecture they spent years constructing has just been heard in full by the one person whose hearing it is catastrophic. Claire, Naomi said, and it was the first time she'd said her name the way she used to say it. You need to move, right now. Claire was already moving. She went left toward the main pier walkway, putting the maximum open space between herself and the man in the dark jacket, and Gavin was in her ear telling her there was a second individual emerging from the pier structure on the north side, and she didn't slow down, didn't run, just moved with the specific deliberate velocity of someone who understands that running triggers a different response than walking fast. Behind her, she heard Naomi say something sharp in a voice she'd never used in 12 years of friendship, not English. And then she heard footsteps accelerating and then a short, strangled sound that stopped just as quickly. Claire did not look back. She was at the main walkway, then the parking structure, then inside Gavin's car, which was idling in the first-level bay, with the engine on and Gavin's second contact already in the back seat, and the door was barely closed before they were moving. What happened on the pier? She said. Naomi's down, Gavin said, accelerating through the structure toward the exit. Not critically. Elias's man. They needed to stop her saying anything further. My contact on the north position called it in. She's conscious. She'll need medical. He moved against her. In the open. Yes. Gavin's voice was measured, but his hands on the wheel were tight. Which means his containment is breaking. He's not operating the way someone in control operates. He's eliminating variables. She told him then. She told him what she was building, where he found it himself. Either way, he knows his organization is compromised from within. He knows his wife knows who he is. And he knows federal interest is closing. Gavin turned onto the street, merging into midday traffic. He's running out of options and he's making moves accordingly. Where are we going? I need to get you somewhere he can't. No. Claire turned to face him. We're not running. Running gives him time to close whatever he can close before the federal investigation moves. Gavin, I need to make a call. To who? Your contact inside the organized crime division, the one who told you about the fund transfers. She held his gaze. I want a meeting today, and I'm bringing everything. Gavin looked at her. The contact in the back seat said nothing. If I walk into that meeting, Claire said, with the recording, the trust documents, the network diagram, the fund transfer timeline, and Naomi's verbal confession about the transfers and the trust, which your recording device in my jacket captured in full. Gavin's eyes moved to her jacket pocket. Then the federal investigation has everything it needs to move on Vail's financial infrastructure immediately, which means asset freezes, which means the money Naomi moved becomes the federal government's problem to untangle, not mine. And my involvement in the trust gets contextualized by the evidence of coercion rather than by the document alone. She paused. It's the only move that protects me. It's also the move that ends your husband's life as he's lived it. His life as he's lived it ended 12 years ago, Claire said. He just didn't tell me. Gavin drove. The city moved past the windows, and then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone and dialed. The meeting happened at 3:15 p.m. in a federal building in downtown Seattle. Not in an interrogation room, in a conference room on the 7th floor with a window and a table, and 2 agents who introduced themselves by name and shook her hand, which she had not expected. They had a recorder on the table. She had one in her pocket. Gavin sat beside her. Her attorney, who she had called from the car, who had met them in the lobby, sat on her other side. She laid everything on the table, the recording, the documents, the network diagram with her annotations, the timeline of the trust signing, the conversation on Pier 66, which had been captured cleanly by the device in her jacket, Naomi's voice perfectly audible over the wind and the water. She walked them through it in the order she'd built the document at 4 a.m. in the Belltown unit, tight, sourced, followable by someone coming to it cold. The 2 agents asked precise questions. She answered them precisely. Her attorney interjected twice. Gavin spoke once, about his own investigation and his federal contacts' prior knowledge. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. At the end of it, the senior agent collected the materials, looked at her, and said, "We'll need you available." "I'm available," Claire said. They walked out into the corridor and the elevator and the lobby and the street, and the afternoon air was cold and carried the first suggestion of a real winter coming, something harder than rain. "What happens now?" Claire said. It wasn't quite a question. "They move," Gavin said. "Probably tonight. Financial freezes first, then physical. They know where the Laurelhurst house is. They know the other properties. If Vale is in Seattle, they'll find him." She nodded. "There's something I need to tell you," Gavin said. He stopped walking. She stopped. The street moved around them. "My contact told me something after you gave your statement, off the record." She waited. "Naomi Cross made contact with the Organized Crime Division 14 months ago. She offered information on Vale's organization in exchange for immunity." He paused. They were in active negotiations. She was building a case from the inside. Claire stared at him. "She wasn't just stealing from him," Gavin said. "She was going to hand him to federal prosecutors. The whole operation, her plan, was to deliver Vale, walk away with the financial assets she'd moved beyond his reach, and disappear with federal immunity protecting her." The street noise continued. A bus went past. "And me," Claire said quietly. "Where did I fit in that plan?" Gavin's expression was the most carefully neutral she had seen it. "You weren't factored in." And there it was. 12 years of friendship that had started as an assignment and somewhere along the way become real. Naomi had told her that on the pier, and Claire believed it, which made it worse, not better. And still, at the end, when Naomi had drawn the map of her own escape, Claire Ashford had been left off of it. Not maliciously, just absently. The way you leave something behind because it was never part of your plan to begin with. She stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building and absorbed that. Then she said, "The warehouse on the waterfront, the one in Gavin's file, the property connected to the Cayman holding entity. Is it still active?" "As of this morning, yes." Gavin looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Because if Elias is running out of options and his organization is fracturing and the woman he trusted is in a hospital and he now knows federal interest is active." She looked at Gavin. "Where does a man like that go when everything he's built starts to come apart?" Gavin said nothing for a moment. "He goes to the last place he controls," Claire said. "The last physical space that's his." "Claire, if he's calling a council, then it's happening tonight. Then walking anywhere near that warehouse is not something I can protect you from. We are talking about a room full of people whose entire world is currently on fire, and I'm not going in." She met his eyes. "But I need to know if he's there. Because if Lucien Vale is in that warehouse tonight with his organization falling apart around him and federal teams mobilizing, then there is one move left that changes everything. Not for him." She paused. "For me." Gavin looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that was not about what she'd said, but about the person saying it. Reading something, calculating something, deciding something. "Tell me the move," he said. The wind came down the street between the buildings, cold and direct, carrying nothing soft with it. Claire pulled her jacket closed. She looked at the federal building behind them, and then at the sound visible at the end of the block, gray and flat and enormous. "He doesn't know yet that I went to them," she said. "He knows I was at the gala. He knows I talked to Naomi. He doesn't know I was in that building for 90 minutes. She looked back at Gavin. "Which means he still thinks he can manage this if he can get to me. He'll try to reach you." "Yes. And when he does, I'm going to answer." Gavin went very still. "What are you going to say?" "I'm going to say what any wife would say if she just found out everything and was frightened and didn't know what to do." She kept her voice even. "I'm going to say that I need to see him, that I need to understand, that I'm not going to anyone until I hear it from him directly. And then I'm going to get him into a room, Gavin." Her voice was quiet and very clear. "And I'm going to ask him everything, on record, with your people outside and federal teams 30 minutes out." She saw something move in Gavin's face that was not quite admiration, more like the acknowledgement of something he hadn't calculated. The way you acknowledge a variable you missed. That's, he started. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Elias Mercer. She looked up at Gavin. He looked back at her. Around them the city moved and the wind moved, and somewhere across the water the last of the afternoon light was doing something cold and specific with the clouds. She answered. Elias, she said. Her voice was exactly what it needed to be. The voice of a woman who was frightened and exhausted and had nowhere to go. Which was true in its way, just not in the way he would hear it. His voice came through the phone, and it was neither Elias nor Lucien. It was something she had never heard from him, something stripped of both performances, something that sounded like a man at the edge of a thing he had built over decades, watching it tilt toward the ground. Where are you? He said. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. I'm in the city. I've been trying to understand. I need to see you. I know. She opened her eyes. The federal building was behind her. Gavin was watching her face. The city moved around them. Tell me where. He told her to come to the house. Not the waterfront warehouse. Not some neutral location stripped of history and furniture. The house in Laurelhurst. Their house. The one with the high ceilings and the kitchen she'd renovated twice, and the wedding photographs on the hallway wall. She stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building with Gavin watching her face and Elias's voice in her ear, and she understood immediately why he'd chosen it. The house was the last piece of the performance he could still control. Lucien Vale was untouchable. Elias Mercer lived in Laurelhurst with his wife and his wine cellar and his tasteful renovation choices, and as long as that image held even nominally, there was something to negotiate from. She said she'd be there in 40 minutes. She hung up. She looked at Gavin. The house, she said. He was already on his phone. She listened to him make 2 calls in under 3 minutes. His organized crime contact, then one of his field people. The federal teams would need time to position, 30 minutes minimum for the closest unit to be in place around the Laurelhurst perimeter. She would go in wired, the device already in her jacket, freshly checked, and Gavin would be in a vehicle 2 blocks out with a direct feed. The moment she had what they needed, or the moment anything moved wrong, he'd bring everyone in. You understand what wired means in this context, Gavin said. Not a question. It means whatever he says in that house is admissible. It means if he decides you're a liability, having a recording doesn't protect you. The teams outside protect you. I understand. If he moves toward you, physically, in any way, I'll use the panic device. Before, not after. Gavin, she looked at him directly. I've been alone in rooms with this man for 12 years. I know how he moves. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he put his phone in his pocket and walked her to the car. The drive to Laurelhurst took 22 minutes in afternoon traffic. Claire sat in the passenger seat and watched the neighborhoods change. Downtown giving way to Capitol Hill, then the residential streets, the mature trees over the sidewalks, the particular quiet that money buys in a city. She had driven this route several thousand times. It had always felt like coming home. She was aware, sitting in Gavin's car with a recording device in her jacket pocket and federal units mobilizing somewhere behind her, that she was grieving something. Not Elias, not even the marriage, but the specific texture of ordinary life. The grocery list on the refrigerator, the pen she left on the kitchen counter, the version of herself who had believed that the life she was living was the life she was actually living. She let herself feel it for about 90 seconds. Then she put it somewhere it would keep and turned her attention to what was ahead. Gavin stopped 2 blocks from the house. She got out. The afternoon light was thin and cold, coming through the tree cover at a low angle that made everything look like the last hour of something. She walked the 2 blocks alone, her footsteps quiet on the wet pavement, and she turned up the front path to the house she had chosen fixtures for and repainted 3 times and known by its creaks and its drafts and its particular 3 a.m. silences. The front door was unlocked. She let herself in. The house was dark except for the study at the end of the hallway, where the light fell in a narrow bar under the closed door. She stood in the entry for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The hallway photographs were still there. Wedding portraits, travel shots, the formal ones from the charity events. 8 years of curated life arranged on a wall. She did not look at them. She walked to the study and pushed the door open. Elias Mercer was sitting behind his desk. He looked the same and completely different in the way that things look. when you suddenly see them without the filter of what you needed them to be. Same face, same posture. He'd always had that quality of occupying space with total deliberateness. Nothing wasted, everything placed. But the performance was gone. There was no warmth and no distance and none of the managed pleasantness that had been his domestic register for 12 years. He was just a man in a room, and he was very tired, and underneath the tiredness was something she recognized from his voice on the phone, the specific gravity of a person watching something enormous tilt. He looked at her when she came in. She stood in the doorway. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. She did not sit down. "You were at the gala," he said. "Yes." "You talked to Naomi?" "Yes." He studied her. His hands were flat on the desk, still. "How long have you known?" 9 days. She kept her voice even. "Since the call that didn't disconnect in the parking garage, 23 minutes and 14 seconds. Something moved in his face. Not guilt. He was past the register of guilt, she thought. Had been past it for a long time. Something more like the acknowledgement of a specific error. The Hong Kong call. "You pocket dialed me, or the connection stayed open when you thought it dropped." She paused. "I heard everything. I heard Naomi. I heard the people you were meeting with. I heard what they called you." The room was very quiet. Outside, a car moved down the street. The house settled slightly, the way old houses do. "And then you hired someone," he said. "Yes." "Who?" "That doesn't matter now." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without difficulty, which surprised her. She had expected this to be harder. The physical presence of him in the room where she'd spent so much of her life, the face she'd woken up next to for 9 years of marriage. But what she felt was not what she had feared she'd feel. She felt clear. The way the air feels after a long rain, when everything that was suspended has finally come down. "What do you know?" he said. His voice was careful, not threatening. Careful the way a man is careful when he's still calculating. "I know about the investment company. I know what it's actually a vehicle for. I know about the Hong Kong meetings, and the Singapore accounts, and the charitable foundations." She kept her tone flat, informational. "I know about Naomi's parallel operation. I know about the Portland meeting and the fund transfers. I know about the trust document I signed 2 months ago and what it's connected to." She paused. "I know who Lucien Vale is." He was quiet. She watched his face process the scope of it, not panicking, which she had expected, but assessing, which was worse in its way because it meant he was still in the mode of a man who thinks there is a move left. "The trust document," he said. "Your signature. I know about the federal interest in it, yes." "Then you know you're exposed." "I was exposed. Past tense." She kept her eyes on his. "I spent 90 minutes in a federal building this afternoon." The room shifted. It was not a physical thing. Nothing moved, the air didn't change. But she watched it happen in Elias's face, the reordering of everything he'd been calculating in the last 20 minutes since she'd walked in. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "You went to them." "I brought them everything. The recording, the documents, the network connections, the fund transfer timeline." She paused. "Naomi's confession, which she made on a pier this morning and which was captured on a device I was carrying." Something finally moved in his expression. It was not the thing she'd braced for. Anger, threat, the Lucien Vale register she'd heard in the parking garage recording. It was something quieter and, in its way, more devastating. He looked like a man who had just understood that a wall he believed in had never been there. "She talked," he said. Not to Claire exactly, to the room. "She's also in a hospital right now. Your man at the pier." His jaw tightened. "That wasn't—" He stopped. "I gave an instruction to intercept, not to harm." The distinction didn't make it to the pier in time. He looked at his hands on the desk. She watched him, really watched him, for the first time in years, without the soft focus of familiarity. He was 51 years old. He had spent the majority of his adult life building an identity that had no bottom to it, no bedrock, Nothing you could stand on without it being something he'd constructed and could dismantle. She had lived inside that construction and called it a marriage. "Why are you here?" he said. "If you've already given them everything, you didn't need to come here. You could have let them—" "I needed to look at you," Claire said. "I needed to be in this room and ask you something directly, and I needed to hear your answer without anyone managing it." He waited. Was any of it real? The question sat in the room. He looked at her, and she watched the calculation happen. She could see it now that she knew what she was looking at, the assessment of what answer served him best. And then she watched something else happen, something that came after the calculation and seemed to override it, something she did not have a clean name for. "The first 2 years," he said, "before the structure around you was fully in place, when you were still just a person I knew." He stopped. He looked at the desk. "I didn't plan to stay as long as I did. The cover was supposed to be 5 years. The domestic component was functional. It served the purpose." He paused. "And then it was 9 years, and I was still here, and I told myself it was because the cover still served the purpose. But," he looked up at her, "but I stayed because of reasons that had nothing to do with the cover, which was a problem I didn't know how to solve, so I didn't solve it. I just kept building walls around it and called it a marriage." Claire stood in the doorway of the study she had straightened and dusted and brought coffee into on 1,000 mornings, and she felt the weight of that sentence do something she hadn't expected. Not break her open, but land and settle and change the shape of the silence in the room. "And Naomi," she said, "when did you know what she was doing?" He was quiet for a moment that was too long to be calculation. "I suspected the fund discrepancies 8 months ago. I didn't have the full picture until 4 days ago." His voice was very even. "She had been inside the organization for 15 years. She knew every structure. She knew every vulnerability. She built the parallel infrastructure with the patience of someone who—" He stopped. "She's extraordinary," he said, and it was the most honest sentence she'd heard from him. "She's the most dangerous person I've ever worked with. And I missed it for 8 months because I was looking at everything except the person who'd always been in the room. She was going to hand you to federal prosecutors. I know. And walk away with your money and federal immunity. I know." A pause. "And she would have succeeded. If you hadn't—" He looked at her. "You moved faster than she thought you would. She thought she knew how I think under pressure." She was right, 12 years ago. He almost said something that might have been a quiet version of a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're not who you were 12 years ago." "No," Claire said. "I'm not." Outside a sound, distant, contained, the kind of organized quiet that only sounds organized if you know what to listen for. She heard it. From his expression, so did he. Vehicles on the perimeter street. More than one. Moving slowly. He looked at the window, then back at her. "How long?" he said. "They've been in position for 20 minutes. She kept her voice level. "They're waiting." He absorbed that. He turned his chair slightly toward the window, then back. He put his hands flat on the desk again. She watched a man who had spent 30 years building an impenetrable structure arrive at the understanding that the structure had already been walked through, not broken, walked through, by the person who'd been living inside it. "There's nothing left," he said. Not a question. "No." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him going through it. The accounts, the properties, the network, the people. Naomi's parallel structures now exposed and frozen. The federal investigation that had 9 years of incomplete evidence now completed by everything Claire had handed them that afternoon. The organization itself, which had been held together by Lucian Vale's invisible authority, and which, when that authority became visible, would fracture into its component self-interested parts within days. "What did you keep back?" he said. She looked at him. "What?" "You went to them with everything, but you're a woman who photographs documents before she signs them." His eyes were steady on hers. "You built a file at 4 in the morning and backed it up somewhere they don't have. What did you keep?" She held his gaze for a long moment. "That's mine," she said. "Everything I kept is mine." He nodded. Once, slowly. and in that nod was something she hadn't expected. Not surrender, not defeat, but a kind of recognition. The look of one person acknowledging another person's competence without reservation. "The house," he said. "The Laurelhurst property. It's held in a clean trust, separate from the operational structure. It was meant as a legitimate asset. If your attorneys move quickly before the federal freeze broadens, they can argue it as marital property predating." "I don't want the house," Claire said. He looked at her. "I don't want anything that came from this," she said. "I want my own name on my own things, and I want whatever is legally mine from the marriage, and I want to be done." She paused. "And I want you to answer one more question honestly." He waited. "The trust document, the one you had me sign 2 months ago. Did you know when you put it in front of me that it would land on me if the organization came apart?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. "Yes," he said. She had known. She had been almost certain since the night in the Belltown unit, when she'd worked through the timing and the structure and understood that nothing Lucian Vale did was accidental. She had known, and she had needed to hear him say it anyway, because there is a specific weight that yes carries when it comes from the right mouth at the right moment, and she needed to carry it out of this room with her. "Okay," she said. She opened the study door. She walked down the hallway without looking at the photographs. She opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, and the cold air of the Laurelhurst evening came at her, sharp and clean, smelling of wet leaves and the sound somewhere behind the houses. She heard footsteps on the path, and Gavin was there, and behind him 2 figures she recognized as federal from the way they moved, and behind them 2 more coming from the side of the house. She stepped down from the porch and moved to the side, out of the path between the door and the approaching figures, and she stood on the front lawn of the house she had lived in for 7 years and watched them go in. She did not hear him resist. She had not expected him to. Gavin came to stand beside her. They stood on the lawn in the cold while the organized business of it proceeded inside the house, controlled voices, the specific sounds of a formal situation being managed carefully. And neither of them spoke for a while. "He talked," Gavin said finally, not asking. "Yes." "Was it what you needed?" She thought about that. The question had 2 answers, and she chose the accurate one. "It was what I needed to hear. I don't know yet if it was what I needed in the other sense." Gavin nodded. He understood the distinction. They brought Elias out through the front door 15 minutes after she'd left the study. He was not handcuffed yet. That happened at the vehicle, she was told later, which was procedural rather than courteous, but had the effect of courtesy. He walked down the front path in his own clothes, and he did not look at the house. He looked, just before he reached the vehicle, at Claire. She met his eyes. She held them for exactly as long as it took to understand that there was nothing left to say between them that had not already been said, and then she looked away first. Not because she lost anything by looking away, because she was done. The vehicle pulled out. She watched it go. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the most organized she had ever lived. Her attorney proved better than expected, which she had chosen her for. The marital assets that were legally separable from the criminal infrastructure were identified and quarantined within the first 10 days, which was faster than the federal timeline, which meant Claire's portion of legitimate marital property, smaller than it might have looked from the outside because so much of what had appeared to be wealth was structural, was protected. The trust document and her signature were fully contextualized by the evidence she had provided and by her own proactive cooperation, and the DOJ Financial Crimes Unit formally removed her from their interest list on a Thursday afternoon in November, which her attorney communicated by phone in a voice that suggested she was more relieved than she'd let on. Naomi Cross spent 4 days in the hospital and was arrested on discharge. The federal immunity she had been negotiating for 14 months was voided by the assault at the pier and by the full scope of the fund transfer scheme that Claire's evidence made visible. The negotiations resumed from a much weaker position. Claire was not kept informed of the details, which was appropriate, but Gavin's contact told him that Naomi had ultimately cooperated with federal prosecutors in a comprehensive way that had less to do with remorse and more to do with the mathematics of what she faced without cooperation. Which was, Claire thought, very Naomi. She did not visit Naomi in the hospital. She did not write. She thought about it once, in the second week, sitting in the temporary apartment she'd taken in Capitol Hill. A furnished studio, someone else's furniture, someone else's light fixtures, which she liked for being completely unconnected to anything she'd built or been built into. She sat with the thought of Naomi and let it be what it was, which was complicated in the specific way that real things are complicated, and then she put it down. The brunch on Eastlake did not happen. She thought once or twice about the booth they would have taken, the coffee they would have ordered, the way the morning light came through those particular windows. She allowed herself that much. The Laurelhurst house was seized as a federal asset. She drove past it once, in December, without planning to. It was on a route she took by accident, and she didn't redirect. She slowed as she passed it. The lights were off. Someone had taken in the potted plants from the porch, probably a neighbor who didn't know yet what had happened and was just being decent. The kitchen windows were dark. She had put new fixtures in those windows 2 years ago. She drove past and did not stop and did not look back. She found a lawyer to handle the divorce proceedings, which were straightforward in the way that divorces from incarcerated defendants are straightforward. She did not attend any of the hearings. Her attorney represented her interests and communicated the outcomes. The decree was finalized on a gray afternoon in February, and her attorney emailed her the confirmation, and she read it in the Capitol Hill apartment with a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside her, and felt something release in her chest that had been there so long she had stopped noticing it. In March, she received a letter. It had gone through multiple forwarding channels. Her attorney, Gavin, eventually her new P.O. box, and arrived without a return address, but with a postmark she recognized as Domestic Pacific Northwest. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 9 lines of handwriting she knew better than she knew her own. Naomi had not explained anything. She had not apologized, which Claire had half expected and half dreaded, because apologies have a way of requiring something from the recipient. Instead, the 9 lines said, in order, that she had watched Claire grow from a girl who filled every silence because she was afraid of what silence meant to a woman who could sit with the whole weight of a thing and not collapse under it. That she had taken credit for that internally in the years when she was both building their friendship and maintaining an assignment, and that she understood now that she had taken credit for something that had nothing to do with her. That Claire had always been the strongest person in any room she was in. That Naomi had known it and had been, for 12 years, in the specific position of someone who keeps a fire contained because they need its heat but cannot afford its light. The last line said, "I'm sorry I needed you to be smaller than you are." Claire read the letter twice. She folded it once. She put it in the back of a desk drawer, not because she intended to forget it, but because she intended to leave it somewhere that required a decision to retrieve. She did not write back. In April, she drove to the coast, not for any external reason. She simply woke up on a Saturday with the feeling that she needed to be somewhere the land ended. She drove 3 hours to a stretch of the Oregon coast she had been to once, years ago, with the kind of weather that did not apologize for itself. She parked, walked a mile down a trail through coastal scrub, and came out on a clifftop overlooking the Pacific. The ocean was doing what the Pacific does in April, moving with a gray, enormous, completely indifferent energy, the kind of scale that does not comfort so much as recalibrate. She stood at the edge of the cliff with her hands in her pockets and the wind doing considerable things to her hair, and she stayed there for a long time. She had thought, driving down, that she might feel something she could name cleanly: resolution, closure. The story-ending feeling that she'd heard described but had always suspected was a narrative convenience rather than an actual experience. What she felt instead was less clean and more real. She felt tired in the good way, the way you feel tired when something that required everything you had is finally finished. She felt the specific lightness of a person who has put down a weight and walked away from it, not recovered from carrying it, not unmarked by it, but not carrying it anymore. And she felt something she could only describe as the sensation of facing a large, open, unwritten space. She reached into her coat pocket. She had been wearing the ring since the divorce decree out of the habit of 9 years, and she had not made a decision about it. It had just been on her hand, a piece of the life that hadn't yet reorganized itself into former life. She took it off now. Not dramatically, just the way you take off something that you've been wearing long enough that the absence of it will take time to register in the skin. She looked at it in her palm. A simple band. She had chosen it herself, which felt now like the truest thing about it. Whatever had been built around that choice, she had made the choice. She put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at the ocean for a while longer. The wind was extremely specific in its coldness, the kind that finds the gap at every collar and cuff. She did not mind it. She had always been better in weather that required you to feel it rather than weather that simply surrounded you. She thought about the woman who had answered a phone call in a parking garage 9 months ago and heard 2 words that rearranged everything. She thought about the hotel room where she'd spent the first night staring at the wall, and the legal pad, and Gavin's cold apartment, and the midnight blue dress on the back of the bathroom door, and the study with his hands flat on the desk. She thought about Naomi's face on the pier, the one moment when the management had dropped and she'd been just a person with too many years of too many things behind her eyes. She thought about the 9 lines of handwriting in the desk drawer, and what it meant that she had put them there instead of burning them or keeping them on the desk. She did not know yet what it meant. She suspected it meant something she would understand in time. She had a meeting on Monday with a woman who ran a financial consulting firm in Portland who had found her through a referral and wanted to talk about bringing someone in to restructure client reporting systems. It was not the work she had done before she was married. It was something adjacent to it, simpler in some ways, more technical in others. She was not sure it was what she wanted to do long term. She was fairly certain that long term was a question she did not need to answer yet, and the recognition of that felt like something she had earned. She turned away from the cliff eventually, not because the view had stopped being worth looking at, but because she was done standing there and ready to walk back. That distinction between stopping because something was finished and stopping because something was ready to begin was the closest thing she had to a philosophy at this moment in her life, and she was not going to dress it up more than that. She walked back along the trail through the coastal scrub. The vegetation was rough and salt-bitten and extremely alive. The sky was the kind of gray that sits right at the boundary between weather and light, and can go either way. The path was wet in places, and she navigated it without looking at her phone and without thinking about where she was going except that she was going back to the car, and then back to the city, and then to whatever Monday was going to be. She reached the trailhead. The parking area was mostly empty. A truck with a dog visible in the window. One other car she didn't recognize. She got in her own car, which was a lease she'd taken in February, nothing connected to the life before, just transportation. She sat for a moment with the engine off. Then she started it. She pulled out of the parking area onto the coast road, heading north. The ocean appeared and disappeared between the tree lines on her left. The radio came on and she left it on. Something instrumental, something without a story to it, just sound. She drove. The road ahead was long and specific and completely, entirely hers.